Having discussed recursive definitions and hopefully provided some context for understanding the framework for Goldman's paper, we're going to pivot our focus back to Goldman's product. He wants to consider these traditional base clause candidates, and he's going to reject them all ultimately. And he's going to do that by adopting a threefold strategy in his arguments against these clauses, his arguments that they are unacceptable. He'll start by disallowing candidate clauses that smuggle in or just blatantly introduce epistemic notions. So remember, he's got this prohibition against epistemic notions, in part because what he wants is a theoretical understanding that deepens our conception and helps us to better integrate our epistemic theories with our real-life practices, or so I claim. Once he's gotten rid of the explicitly epistemic or covertly epistemic notions, he'll define vague or undefined clauses. And then once he has suitably defined non-epistemic versions of these clauses, he'll then contemplate and ultimately reject each of them. So the first candidate clause is a familiar clause for us, indubitability. We'll remember that from Descartes. So as Goldman gives it to us, the clause goes as follows. If S believes P at T and P is indubitable for S at T, then S's belief in P at T is justified. And in presenting these, I break them down into each clause, the antecedent of the conditional there, then the consequent of the conditional below it. When Goldman contemplates this, he says, well, look, indubitable, cannot doubt, that is most straightforwardly understood in epistemic terms, as the evidence is overwhelming or compelling beyond doubt. And he says, that violates my prohibition against epistemic terms. We want to go beyond the language of epistemology, the evaluative and normative notions that are part of that system to integrate our theories with the world. And so we'll have to find a different way to deal with that. Well, the only other real way of understanding it is as a psychological state in which one cannot doubt something. And this is, in fact, consistent with Descartes. Descartes actually merges these two notions together. When I cannot doubt something, then it compels my assent. When there is no absence of clarity and distinctness in my judgment, when it's perfectly resonant to me that this has to be the case, then it compels my assent. And so Alvin says, okay, so what we're really talking about here is a sensation or perhaps a psychological compulsion. The difficulty being is that we don't have any basis for supposing that that sensation or compulsion connects us to the world in any way more definite than the content of the belief itself, and hence can't really help us to feel confident about the belief's veridicality. We might think about it this way. Consider two psychological states. My belief that there's a red rose in a vase and my sensory perception of a red rose in the vase. Now, we say that my belief that there's a red rose in the vase requires justification because there's nothing about that psychological state that guarantees its veridicality. When I look at my perception that there's a red rose in the vase, the same problem emerges. There's nothing about that psychological state that I'm in that guarantees from my own subjective perspective that it connects me to the reality of a rose in a vase. That's why I include the subjective certainty lab, because what we discover with the subjective certainty lab is that I have these psychological perceptions of how clear-cut something is, how well event something is. But then when I test the calibration of my subjective perceptions of the weight of the evidence, what I discover is that my calibration isn't very good. That psychological state is just that. It's a psychological state. Its relationship to the actual world, or in this case, its assessment of my overall evidential basis for my belief about the world, is not intrinsically calibrated. It's not intrinsically related from my subjective perspective to the world in a way that's capable of being leveraged for epistemic justification. Put another way, it's just as easy for me from a psychological subjective perspective to misperceive the world as it is for me to misperceive the nature of my evidence about a belief I have about the world. world as it is for me to mistakenly form a belief about the world. These are all psychological states that depend for their veracity or justification on their relationship to the world, and none of them gives me any leverage or insight into that relationship in and of themselves. What about our next clause? Our next clause is self-evidence. If S believes P at T and P is self-evident, then S's belief in P at T is justified. Now, Alvin gives us three possible ways of understanding self-evidence here. Either it's just being used as a synonym for justified, that is, it is sufficiently evinced, or it is an analytic truth, as in its truth follows simply from its meaning, or again, it's something like a psychological compulsion or a psychological sensation. He also notes that very few truths are actually self-evident in this way. So none of these things make self-evidence look like a plausible base clause candidate. So I'll end the lecture module here, and then we'll begin the next lecture module on the third base clause candidate.